today, who's been so kind to join us from the Burgwin-Wright house. Originally from France, Christine Lamberton moved to the U.S. to attend college in North Carolina. She is a University of North Carolina Wilmington alumni with a master's degree in public history with a concentration in museum education and historic houses. She taught history at UNCW for 7 years and has worked in various local museums, including 3 years on the battleship Wilmington, Battleship North Carolina, excuse me, the programs department. Today, in addition to directing the Burgwin-Wright House since 2013, she runs after a 4-year-old boy and a 7-month-old baby girl. So we are very lucky to have her take her time to spend with us this morning. So Christine, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. So I hope everybody is well. The Burgwin-Wright House, a couple bragging points. This is the front of the house right there that you see on the screen. The Burgwin-Wright House and Gardens is the oldest and largest property in Wilmington open to the public. In fact, we celebrated 70 years as a museum in the month of March. The very first tour took place on March 31st, 1951. Of 8 colonial structures left in Wilmington, 4 of those structures are right here on the Burgwin-Wright House property. And they're the ones you see highlighting in blue. Here is a map of our property. We have them, and I think you can see my mouse, Tina, pointing to everybody.
Yes,
but
I can
the
see
main
it.
mansion. Yep, here's the main mansion, and here is our kitchen house that are left on the property. 3 of those buildings are actually, 2 of those buildings, rather, 2 of our ballast stone buildings are underneath the mansion, and then one of them is our kitchen house. So as you can see, our 1744 jail building is right here. That was the main building. That's where the sheriff's office and the cages were located. And the little door you see below here was actually the entrance to the dungeon, and it was always underground, so very vulnerable, prone to flooding. And this building here is our kitchen house, and the Ballaststone Foundation was originally the jailer's quarters where he and his family lived. The top portion of it was built in 1954 and now houses the state archives, the North Carolina State Archives for the NCDA. And then this portion of the jail that remains were the debtor cells. There would have been big iron bars over the 2 cells. You could rent out your labor to pay off your debt if you owed money, or if you were a poor farmer who had lost his crop and was indebted to a merchant, you could work it off your debt to the merchant, or you could work it off your debt with another farmer. And of course, very popular example of stocks and pillories, very popular with the kids and adults alike, a mock-up of what would have been in the gardens during that time. And lastly, the very first picture taken of Wilmington dates back to 1847, and the Burgwin-Wright House is one of the subjects in that first picture. So Burgwin-Wright House has been at the corner of 3rd and Market for over 250 years and is considered one of our main historic landmarks because it is in the very center of town and because we have almost 2 acres right in the center of historic Wilmington surrounding the property. That was originally the jail compound where you had the stocks and pillories, the whipping post, and unfortunately we did have gallows here for 30 years. So that's interesting to talk about, very complex history. Now, despite all this rich history, this property almost became a gas station and did at one point have a used car lot. So this is a picture of 1950s used car lot, what was once the gallows and what is today part of our property again as our orchard. When our last private owner, Mrs. Wiggins, passed away in 1930, the property was transferred to the Wilmington Savings and Trust Company, which was a bank. And of course, it wasn't long before Standard Oil took an interest in the lot right at the corner of 3rd and Market. And as you know, many corners in historic districts have lost their historic landmarks to Standard Oil in the 30s, building gas stations and convenient locations because the automobile was becoming very prevalent. But they were not interested in the house, of course. And so we were going to lose it. And when the North Carolina Dames learned of this proposal, they were really dismayed at the thought of losing this historical landmark, because even though back in the 1930s, there were a few more colonial structures left than there are today, it was still one of the only ones left and one that was so prominent. And they really started asking themselves, should they acquire their house as a headquarters? Other state societies were doing so. Dunbarton House in Washington, D.C., which now houses the national headquarters for the Colonial Dames, had just been purchased. And so the timing seemed right. But of course, they're unable to convince the bank to sell it to them for the price that they can afford as a nonprofit, because Standard Oil was always, willing to pay so much more for that purchase. And so to buy themselves some time to fundraise towards the purchasing price, they came up with a really clever idea. And the reason I know all this is I actually read every single minute from 1894 up until the 1980s that was ever taken for the society. So I kind of got a big picture of what was happening. And they very clearly indicate in the minutes that they're going to keep losing to Standard Oil. So how can we keep buying ourselves time? And they find a way that they know is going to just drag on. They involve the federal government. They petitioned to have the property surveyed in an attempt to declare the house as a historical shrine by the federal government, which would prevent its demolition. And they were going on the premise that this had been an important house during the Revolution, that Lord Cornwallis himself had used the house as a headquarters. And there's some truth to that. Lord Cornwallis was at the Burgwin-Wright house. He was entertained. It was the most well-known home, and it was the home of a loyalist. But he never used it as his headquarters. Although until recently, even many locals still believe this to be a fact, and it's actually nicknamed locally the Cornwallis House. And of course, this attempt fails. The federal government writes back, and we actually have a copy of this letter several years later. That's how long it took. That this is a wonderful architectural example of Georgian architecture, that the history is indeed rich, but that they're not interested in structures and more interested in battlefields. And also, it can't be a historical shrine to American history when Lord Cornwallis is associated to it. He's the wrong side of history, and they're not interested. But this was a really clever way of delaying the sales. And it also, during that time, brought them time to campaign and make this more of a local effort. Do we really want to lose our history to modernization and the gas station and this company that's not local and so forth? And so by the time this attempt fails and Standard Oil is able to continue the process of purchasing it, there's a lot of disfavor towards that in the community. And also, one of the members' husband was the president of the bank at the time. And so you can imagine the dinner conversations with his wife about selling this to Standard Oil. And finally, 7 years after they started campaigning to save this house from demolition, Standard Oil finally pulls out. They've given up. It's been 7 years. They find another corner, and the bank agrees to sell the house for $21,000. The ladies intended from the very beginning to open the house as a public museum that they would interpret and that would really encompass their mission of patriotism, preservation, and education. But the house, as you can see, had fallen into disrepair during this time. They referred to the property as the unit. You can see this is a survey from the 1930s. This right here is where the orchard is today. That was where their used car lot was in the 50s. They were able to purchase about 3/4 of the property back in 1937. And the buildings you see in blue are the buildings that remain today. The ones in red are the ones that have since been lost. At the time that they purchased it, they were fundraising to restore the main house, the kitchen house, the two blue structures you see, the slave quarters, the carriage house, and several of the cookhouses, because they were very much aware that these structures intact made this property very unique. Interestingly enough, they did not take into consideration the fact that the jail buildings were still here from 1744, made it even more unique. They were really interested in the domestic aspect of the property. They were able to restore the exterior of the house, big difference from the first picture I just showed you. And at the last board meeting of 1941, they were really looking forward to restoring the interior of the house the following year at the beginning of 1942. 4 days after that meeting, Pearl Harbor was attacked. And as a result, it was decided that all energies towards restoring the headquarters really should be channeled towards the war effort. And so that meant that the interior of the house remained completely unrestored, no light, no electricity, no plumbing, nothing. They really focused on the exterior, making the shell of it, modernized and beautiful, but the interior was completely devoid of any modern conveniences. But they really wanted it to serve in some capacity as part of the war effort. And as a matter of fact, side note, they wanted the Red Cross to use it. A lot of them volunteered, wrapping bandages and so forth. And they really wanted Red Cross to use this as a hospital. And of course, Red Cross, and I have the minutes to talk about a meeting with a representative from the Red Cross. The Red Cross is really interested because the lot is very large and the house is very big. They're oohing and ahhing about how beautiful it is on the exterior. They get to the front door, they open the front door, and at the front door, they say, "I'm so sorry. We cannot use it as a hospital because, again, no electricity, no running water." And the ladies were very dismayed. But their wish did come true in 1943 when the city of Wilmington leased the headquarters for $1 and in return invested $5,000 in repairs inside. The understanding was that they would not take away anything of historical architectural value, but that they would bring in electricity and water, and that it would become known as an officers' club for all the officers that were in town. And it was nicknamed the Lord Cornwallis Lounge for officers of the armed forces. And we understand that a lot of young couples were married at the Lord Cornwallis Lounge and spent their honeymoon in the bride room, which is today our master bedroom. And at one of the reunions here in Wilmington for the 60th anniversary, a lot of these couples came back with wedding pictures. One lady brought in her wedding dress to display. So there was that World War II connection as well. Now, after the war, the house underwent a full restoration in a very Williamsburg colonial style manner. And by that, I mean, colonial Williamsburg at the time was basically the beacon of colonial history, but it was very much focused on New England history, New England colors, New England furnishing, but they were the model. And so the museum initially was more of a decorative arts museum rather than a history museum. Again, this is a very typical early museum model of the time. What's interesting is that all the furniture you see and where they're placed in this picture in 1951, this picture was taken. When I began working there as a director in 2013, all those pieces of furniture were still in the very same position. The drapes were still there. The only thing that's missing, was the bouquet right here. Everything else was still the way it was from 1951. Now, unfortunately, we did lose the slave quarters to a cigarette fire in 1949. And the carriage house was lost to Hurricane Hazel in 1954. So the initial vision of having this compound, this unit, lost some of its very significant buildings. Now, throughout the years, as the field of history and historic house museums became more professional and more research came to light about the house and the families, the ladies did incorporate that into their interpretation, as well as taking on many projects to make the house more authentic, but nothing was done on a grand scale like it had been done back in the late 40s. And finally, in 2016, we were able to secure a grant and a large donation that made it possible for the house to undergo a full transformation back to what it looked like when it was newly built in 1770. You can see the house, what I call the house was tired. The paint color had obviously changed from the sun. Over the years, the house had been maintained by waxing the longleaf pine floors, and it wasn't necessary. The longleaf pine floors were the heart of the longleaf pine. They didn't need to be waxed. As a matter of fact, the wood didn't, what I call, drink the wax. It would just sit on top, and we were having some issues with the furniture sticking. The house was not completely climate controlled. The machines kept failing. We had 4 units, and they just were older. So the house would get very humid. The furniture would stick to the wax that was on top. They had rugs, which was something that was not common in the 1770s in the port city, that was sandy and watery because you would trap the sand. And so just from having visitors through that would bring in debris, it was actually sanding our original floors. So the house, like I said, was, I don't know what's happening. The house was what we call tired. And we were really fortunate to work with a local preservationist, the late Edward Turbird, to do our paint analysis. He used a very traditional paint scraping method as well as laser technology to get back to the original colors of the house. The longleaf pine floors just needed a good cleaning, and we were able to find a solution that was natural. And you can see the phases of when it was dark and full of wax to being clean and in a beautiful wood grain. And initially we were only able to do the grand entrance halls. So the very central part of the house was restored, and then the side rooms were not for about a year. And so we would, of course we wanted the other part of the house is restored, but it was kind of interesting to show the guests the difference between the house pre-restoration and the house post-restoration, as you can see. The house restoration was completed in 2018, and we were really honored to receive a preservation award for the project. And so today when you visit, you actually walk through the rooms like it looked the very first day John Burgwin opened his door into his newly built urban townhouse in 1770. Now the house is named Burgwin-Wright because John Burgwin, pictured here, is the original owner. He is the gentleman who had the house built, but he never actually lived in the house. His favorite house was actually right next door in Wilmington. He was a second-born son that was born and raised in England. And because he was the second-born son, his father told him, you can go into the clergy, you can go into the military, or you can go seek your fortune. Now, his father was very business-oriented, something John Burgwin inherited from him, and saw an opportunity in his young son. At 19, he sends him to Charleston with papers to introduce him into society and essentially establish a leg to his mercantile business. By the time John Burgwin is 23, 4 years in Charleston, he is the wealthiest young man in the Southeast. He's very popular, he's part of society, he's entertained, he entertains back, he's well off. However, what he seeks is a wife that is landed, because if he becomes landed, he can become involved in politics. And on one of his trips to Wilmington, he's introduced to a young lady named Margaret Haynes. We do understand from their letters there was some affection, but I always kind of joke that the best part about Margaret Haynes was that she had no brothers. He stood to inherit all of her father's fortune. He owned what is today a modern day town. It was called Castle Haynes Plantation, and it's today called Castle Haynes, the town. And he writes to his older brother in England that he's a little disappointed by the dowry. It's only 1,000 acres and 100 enslaved people. So that kind of gives you an idea of the fortune he stood to inherit and his ambition. We understand that John Burgwin in his lifetime owned over 300 individuals. He had 4 working plantations, 7 houses in Wilmington, and 5 ships that went to the Caribbean, New England, and France and England. He did very well for himself, and he became involved in politics. He was the secretary to the Lord governors, 3 Lord governors, rural governors rather, in North Carolina, Tryon being the last. He was the treasurer for the colony, very well connected, and he found himself in a pickle. During the Revolutionary War, he was landed here, his fortune was here. However, born and raised in England, working for the crown. He did sell some gunpowder to the Loyalists at Morse Creek, but he kind of tiptoed the line as long as he could and finally chose to stay loyal to the king. And so John Burgwin was a loyalist. After the war, he was pardoned, and he sold his house to Joshua Granger Wright. And if you're familiar with Wrightsville Beach or Wilmington, a lot of things are named Wright, Wrightsville Beach, Wright Avenue. It's a very prominent local family. And they are the ones who really lived here and made the Burgwin-Wright house their home. They lived in the home for 80 years and had a number of children. And that is why the house is named Burgwin-Wright House. John Burgwin built this lavish townhome. It was the largest home. He was the highest standing official. And he built this home with one intention only, to impress and to entertain, and really to house people who came to town that he wanted to make connections with, or who were royal officials of their own. Instead of having them go to a boarding house or having them stay in his own private home, he built this house so they had somewhere to stay as well. And his we call it the grand entrance hall, because that was the point. His entrance hall rather, is larger than the average home in the colonial era. Think of even Little House on the Prairie 150 years later. His entrance hall is bigger than what you can imagine that house being. You'll notice the horsehair plaster. We found some of the original pieces still in the house. We never had a fire at the Burgwin-Wright house. And we really credit the fact that we have those 2 acres surrounding it. So if a neighboring home is on fire, it never made it to our rooftop. Most homes surrounding the Burgwin-Wright house, especially towards the river, because of our tar and turpentine industry, are made of brick now, because they were lost in fire, not the Burgwin-Wright house. His parlor had a dual function. He would entertain, serve tea during the day, and then all the furniture can be folded back, have wheeling casters, and that would turn into basically a ballroom for about 4 or 5 couples. We had a private sitting room. We have a private sitting room for evenings when he was not entertaining, or for his guests when they were renting out the house. His office, and what's interesting about his office is that on one hand, it was the most public room in the house. Anyone who came during the day for business, including enslaved workers, would be ushered into that room to do business with John. But in the evenings, it could become a very private room, and we can imagine he had quite an interesting conversation. The gentleman in the large portrait was the governor he worked for the longest, Arthur Dobbs. He's the gentleman who had to tell the colonists they had to pay for the French and Indian War. Not very popular because of that, and a lot of the rebellion took place under his reign. And then the gentleman in the smaller portrait that looks like a founding father is William Hooper. He is a signer of the Declaration of Independence here in North Carolina, and a Wilmingtonian. And him and John Burgwin were neighbors. They were very, very good friends. William Hooper, John Burgwin, and Harnett signed a document with an oath of allegiance to the king in the early days of the rebellion. But as you know, Harnett and Cornelius Harnett and William Hooper became war heroes, essentially, patriot war heroes. And we understand that William Hooper never forgave John. As a matter of fact, when John was seeking a pardon, the Wright family, who was also tiptoed that line a little bit during the Revolution, vouched for him. A lot of local merchants, a lot of local friends, but William Hooper was one of the few who wrote a letter saying he should not be pardoned. He should be sent back to England. He never forgave him for not fighting alongside him and Harnett. His dining room would have been upstairs in the very top floor, get away from the smells of Market Street, the noise, the mosquitoes. But also, I always tell people that he might invite you for tea because it's an hour commitment, it's daytime. But if he's inviting you for dinner at this point, especially in town during the season, he's making a commitment, at least 4 or 5 hours, if not longer. And so now he's impressing you. And sure enough, out of any of these windows, you can see to the river, you can see all his properties he would have owned. This is really a room where John Burgwin is trying to impress you. We have a guest bedroom, and we know quite a bit about this room because John Burgwin's daughter, Eliza Burgwin, left a 17-volume diary. She started writing autobiography and diary. She started recording it when she was 14, all the way up until about 3 years before she passed away at 78. So we know quite a bit about her story, and we know about this room because when her father sold the house to the Wrights, He was an older father in his 50s, early 60s when his children were teenagers. He was not interested in going to the balls anymore. But his friends, the Wrights, had 8 children and had a lot of balls to attend. So he would send his daughter to his former home where they lived, and she would stay in the guest bedroom because her father was higher ranking than the Wrights. So she didn't stay with her girlfriends in the nursery. She would stay in the guest bedroom and write what 15, 16-year-old girls write in their diaries. So we know quite a bit about what would have been in that room and what took place. And then the master bedroom, of course. The door you see in the corner leads to actually this office that I'm in right now. It's an addition that the Wright family added because, as you can see, the house was not very large and could not accommodate 8 children. So there was a need for an addition in the back of the house for those 8 children. That was added in 1845. Our kitchen house is where the jailer's quarters used to be. It was just one room with a large hearth. Today, it's our kitchen house. We understand that John Burgwin used it for his enslaved cook. That is where she slept and ate and cooked all the meals for the family. The piece directly in front of you is our food safe. It's very sharp on the outside, very smooth on the inside. You can see all the patterns. I regret not having a close-up of the picture now of the food safe. It was actually built by an enslaved person that lived next door to John Burgwin. We believe it goes back to about 1804. And it's one of our few artifacts that we know was locally made, and we have a record that it was made by an enslaved person. Our property, like I said, is almost 2 acres. We offer a self-guided tour. That map that I showed you earlier is the part of the self-guided tour. It's a map, and then the front has all the history. Here are some of images of our property. So the front, the reason I noted the front is that it's very formal. The back of the property is less formal. It looks more like it belongs in the middle of a rural setting. Both were the design that John Burgwin had, but one was very formal, facing the public, and one was a little bit more, I call it a little bit more cozy, a little bit more homey in the back. These are our parterre gardens. Our orchard, unfortunately, at one point in time was the gallows. I was told to stop selling the property as a venue for weddings because I would always tell the brides, and here under the arbor where you're going to be exchanging your vows, that used to be the gallows, and that made me very unpopular with the brides. But it's really interesting when you think about it. A property is so complex that when you look at it today, you would never imagine the deep history it has. And we try to be very sensitive to the types of people that lived and worked here and that were incarcerated, because in the colonial era, typically the people who were incarcerated were mainly the poor. We have an array of blooms. Here, our dipping well area is actually where this carriage house used to be that was lost. And we understand that the bricks of the carriage house were recycled into the property for the walls on the pathways. Another view from our dipping well. And then just a view to show you some of our, and then here's a view from the archives door, if you're standing at the archives door of the courtyard with the jail. We do have a gift shop. We only carry local in North Carolina products. Now, actually, my gift shop is about 95% all Wilmingtonian artists and merchants, trying to just support our local economy. We have an art gallery. The main jail building was modernized by the Wright family. So we lost a lot of the historical integrity that we did not lose in the kitchen house. I always tell people that the kitchen house was first for the jailer, then it was for the enslaved cook, then it was turned into a garden shed when the kitchen's brought indoors. So it's always overlooked. But now to me, it's become one of the most significant spaces because when you walk in, you really get a sense of what it looked like in 1744. The reason we have an art gallery in the main jail building is that it had been plastered over a century before. We would never, ourselves, have done that. But it's part of our visitor center. You walk in, you've got the gift shop, my office. I'm right there for every guest to meet. And then we have the art gallery. And we have an art show every month by a local artist in Wilmington. So we are up to 54 shows, and we're actually booked through 2023, always local. We have an exhibit hall that we add to regularly. I really felt it was important that every guest that walked into the property, into the visitor center, could get some history without having to pay admissions. I think it's very important that they have a sense of the history that took place on the property without having to commit to taking a tour. So this kind of puts the house in context and explains to them what took place here. And of course, the tour goes into more detail. One of the longest standing programs that we have is called People of the Past. It's the 4th grade program. It began in 1952. Every New Hanover County 4th grader that goes to public school has been to the Burgwin-Wright house since 1952. Our current mayor, was here in 4th grade, and many chaperones remember coming when they were in 4th grade. And so it's very special. But again, that goes back to the commitment of turning the Burgwin-Wright house into a museum that would interpret it for the public. We were just awarded 2 plaques, blue plaques, that signify that our structure is more than 200 years old. The Burgwin-Wright house has always had a plaque, but like I mentioned, the jail was always overlooked. I'm not sure why. I find it to be fascinating. So finally, we have a plaque for the 1744 jail as well. And then these are some of the events that you can always count on when you come visit us: art shows, night tours, lectures, of course. Our birthday tea, which was last weekend, celebrating the museum's birthday. We have craft markets with 30 local vendors. A lot of these vendors, this is their livelihood. And so we just provide them a venue for them to have their craft markets. Garden, art, preservation workshops. We have a conservators coming from South Carolina doing a workshop with people interested in antiques next month, a Christmas open house, and then an oyster roast. So I hope that I will see you someday at the Burgwin-Wright house right here in Wilmington. And thank you for joining me for this very brief overview. I could keep talking, believe me, about the Burgwin-Wright house. If you have any questions, Tina.
Yes, please type your questions or comments into the chat. One thing that's always struck me about the house, a little bit I know about your house, but here in Charleston is the terrible things that Standard Oil was getting ready to do here in Charleston, most notably with the Joseph Manigault house, or even a used car lot and a gas station, and they ended up having a gas station on their property for a number of years. So it's always interesting to hear those different stories in different places in the 1920s. Here's a question from Angeline. I saw the map with the tunnels. Did one or more lead from the river to the house?
That exhibit addresses some of the myth and lore with the tunnels. The tunnels are actually, there are 5 tunnels that are built over these natural springs and streams that we have in Wilmington still to this day that are underneath our roads. Originally, the Burgwin-Wright house was built into a hill, but only the dungeon was underground. Now today, even our visitor center is underground because the city has built up the streets. Those tunnels were a way, essentially when John Burgwin was here, there was a stream right next to his property, and a stream that's the most well-known Jacob's Run, that were navigable by small vessels. And every time it would rain, or every time there was a bad storm, they would wash away the dirt roads or flood the homes. And so in 1812, Wilmington devised this plan to break over or to make tunnels over the springs, so the springs could still be accessible at the end of the river, at the waterfront, but they could raise their roads and have essentially brick stone roads that would no longer wash out. And there's a lot of stories about people running away from the jail. There's a lot of stories about merchants using them to have easy access to their ships, Native American attacks, piracy. And that's a lot of the myth and lore. There's just 7 tunnels. If you go into them today, they're falling apart. They were cypress floors, and the water would just go over the cypress floors. They would start at the beginning of the spring, so people could access them and get their water about 4 feet in height. And by the time they make it to the river, there's just little portholes. And as a matter of fact, if you're on the Cape Fear River today during low tide, you can actually still see 2 of the portholes. But over the years, these tunnels have collapsed. These springs have either dried out. Just recently, about 3 years ago, Dr. Fonville found the entrance to Horse Spring at the front of the river. again, completely dry. What really started the story about the tunnels and this resurgence and this interest in the tunnels was in the 1970s. First bank across the street was being built, and they realized that underneath their vault was nothing. And they realized that one of the old tunnels was running underneath their bank, underneath their vault. They were not pleased. And they were certainly not pleased when the construction caused part of the tunnel to collapse. And that was when a lot of people had access, not very far, into the tunnels, and these stories came about. But they're really just springs, old springs. Now, every property was encouraged to drain their wells back into the main tunnels because of the water issue. And so Burgwin-Wright House does have, excuse my English, again, it's not my native tongue, tributaries, is that what it's called?
Mhm.
Just a small little tunnel that goes from our well back into Jacob's Run to dry out our well. And they had asked all citizens to do that and reroute their water into these so that they would be only accessible at the mouth of the river, the fresh water. You'd have to go fetch it so that the town would stop essentially flooding. But we don't think about what's underneath. It's, you know, Swiss cheese. There's tunnels everywhere in Wilmington.
Have there been any archaeological, has there been any archaeological investigation on the site? Are there any planned?
So that's something that we've discussed, especially with my background. I have a degree in archaeology minor. And there's been a lot of interest. A lot of people thought they were bones. A lot of that when the prisoners were executed, they were buried on site. That is false. We do not have. There's been some accidental digs when we've worked on certain areas. Like, for instance, we found a trash pit where we were working on the fence near where was the former cookhouse. So informally, yes. Formally, there's some concerns because a lot of our property has historic bricks. Some of them were made by enslaved people throughout, and they're worried about damage, but it's something we have to consider. Now, I call this a live archaeological site. After heavy rain, I know where 2 trash pits were, one of which was where the slave quarters were. We still find artifacts that wash up. And just recently, and when I say recently, about 5-6 years ago, we found part of an old lantern, carriage lantern, where the carriage house used to be. So yes, after hurricanes, after heavy rains, we still find artifacts, and we catalog them. We put them in the correct boxes. We keep track of everything. But in terms of having a formal dig, I'm not sure that that's something that we consider feasible at the moment.
Okay. You mentioned the diaries that one of the young daughters had kept. How were these discovered, and are they on display at the museum?
So they're not on display at the museum. You can actually, they're public. The family donated them, and you can access them there at Chapel Hill. You can actually Google Eliza Burgwin's diary. They come right up, and you can read them. They have the diaries, and we just have them digitized essentially. And I'm happy to send them. We can't email them; they're too large. But I'm happy to always share them. I send them USB, or you can go through the university. They've been donated too long, and so they're now public domain.
Okay. Who funds the transportation of the students for your program?
So we don't charge admissions, never have, to the museum. So that is something that New Hanover County provides. And every class in New Hanover County is allowed 1 field trip a year. And the 4th graders come to our house. We do the program in conjunction now with the Cape Fear Museum. So they come to our house in the Cape Fear Museum, and I always explain that they're getting a macro view of Cape Fear history at the museum, and then they get a micro little vignette of colonial history here, with the house being the artifact itself.
How did the story that Lord Cornwallis had used it as his headquarters get started, and how did you debunk that?
So actually historians as early as the 50s were letting the ladies know that this was very likely false. So essentially what happened is Cornwallis was entertained here. This was a well-known royal official's home, loyalist. He would come for dinner, have a good dinner along his piers. But we know that his headquarters were actually closer to the river. near where his main camp. We have maps that say headquarters. But there was a letter that was written by a neighbor who talks about how impressive it was to see Lord Cornwallis. A lot of people don't realize a lot of Wilmingtonians were loyalists. Wilmington was very loyal. It was a little pocket of loyalists. And so he talks about how impressive it is to see one evening, seeing Lord Cornwallis coming down these large white steep stairs, in full uniform, Lord Cornwallis. And that letter, oral history is very powerful. That letter became Lord Cornwallis was here. Lord Cornwallis stayed here. Lord Cornwallis stayed here the entirety of his time here in Wilmington, and then Lord Cornwallis made his headquarters at Burgwin-Wright House. It's not accurate. Lord Cornwallis would come and have a good dinner among people he could talk to, but he really, and this is something that we tell our guests, he was brilliant. Lord Cornwallis was brilliant. I mean, he may have lost the colonies, but he conquered another part of the world. He really did not feel comfortable talking with his other officers or his men, having meetings in private homes. It didn't matter if you were a loyalist or not, he believed the walls had ears. And he was very much aware that people may seem loyal or may not be. He was very worried about those kind of things. So he tended to not have headquarters in people's homes.
Oh, that's really interesting.
But it's smart.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What church is in the background of the first photos you shared, and is it still standing?
It is, and as a matter of fact, the post I posted today on Instagram and Facebook is St. James. It's our neighbor. It was the church that John Burgwin actually attended, and whose daughter's mother-in-law and her husband are buried in the graveyard. It's the oldest church here in Wilmington, St. James, excuse me.
Okay. Why did Burgwin choose that particular site to build on top of the jail?
For several reasons. First of all, we are the corner of 3rd and Market. We are the very center of downtown Wilmington, historic Wilmington. And we were reading the deeds. We read the property deeds starting from 1739 onward to kind of see the ownership. This was a very desirable corner, even back in 1730s and 40s. It was the center of town even then. The church was across the street, which was the Church of England. The courthouse was right down the street, and now it's actually my other neighbor across the street. It was also the top of a hill, which is really strategic. We're built on top of a hill. It's all downstream, right? So it was very desirable. John Burgwin happened to own. His favorite home was next door to this property. So it was easy for him to just combine it. He also owned across the street, the blocks across the street. And he owned all the land down from our property, 3rd Street, all the way down to the river. And he had his wharfs. And so business-wise, strategically speaking, it was also very desirable. But the ballaststone buildings, of course, sandy, watery soil, we don't have stone here. It's all ballast left over from the ships. You've got these structures that are 9 feet tall, made of stone. They've jails be decommissioned and put on, asked to be relocated outside of town. You're not going to demolish them. They're already here. And so he erects his house using them as a foundation. This is essentially a house on stilts. It doesn't flood. It keeps it safe. We have no termite damage because of the longleaf pine and the ballast. The dungeon still floods. After Hurricane Florence, we flooded 2 feet, but our visitor center was safe. So was the house. It's made it through every hurricane except for it's lost a chimney here and there and some shutters. So in terms of material, it was very, and by the time John Burgwin purchases the property, Wilmington's getting smaller and smaller in terms of there's not as much desirable land on this street left. But now here's this 2 acres that's opening up because the jail's been decommissioned. Mind you, it's not a coincidence that the jail was decommissioned. John Burgwin was on that board. And when the town talks about putting the property for sale, John said, hey, don't worry about it, I'll buy it. John was really interesting. He was pivotal in bringing people to Wilmington. Wilmington was not a desirable port city. There was one closer to Southport, and he tended to acquire real estate, and we see him flipping it. He buys all this real estate, and then he sells it to people he considers desirable. So he sells it to his friends and people he wants strategically living in Wilmington. It's really brilliant, but he kept this corner for himself.
Did he go to England during the war? Or did he stay in
He
Wilmington?
did go to England during the war. So when it became very clear that, he was the head of the militia, he had keys to the armory, he got caught selling gunpowders to the wrong side. It was becoming, kind of hot for him here. He excuses himself and goes back to England for the duration of the war. He does come back, we have found twice during the war, to check on business assets, but he stays in New England. He checks on his business assets from New England. He had nephews here in town. Margaret Haynes had a sister, but not a brother. And her children, at the time he had not remarried and had his children of his own, he considered those boys his own. And because they are native Wilmingtonians and their mother had married somebody who was native to the area, they didn't feel the same pressure as John Burgwin, who was a royal official, and they took care of his properties. And that's part of the reasons he got pardoned. He had a lot of friends who forgave him for leaving because they understood his position, but who were powerful here in Wilmington.
What happened to him after the revolution?
He came back, he got his pardon, he got all his properties back. He sold this property to the Wrights, who had vouched for him and helped him get his pardon, and who were good friends. He's older. He has just remarried and he had 2 children. He had one in England during the war, John Burgwin Jr. He is panicked and wants to get back to Wilmington right after the war, and his poor wife was 9 months pregnant. He made her take the voyage. He absolutely wanted his wife to come with him. So she comes with him. She actually gave birth to Eliza, his daughter, in Charleston, the very night they landed. Poor lady. And then 9 months later, she gets pregnant with a third. And they said that in letters you read that she cannot take the humidity here. She does not like the heat. Back-to-back pregnancy. She never recovered from the daughter's birth. She passed away and left him with 3 children, all under the age of 4. And he's not really interested. He sends the newborn, he sends the toddler that's barely a year old, and he sends his 3-year-old back to England to live with her aunts, their aunts rather. And he keeps the newborn because he needs somebody to nurse it. And we believe he had a wet nurse keep the newborn. That's the only child that grew up here. But he kind of retires from politics. He's still part of society, but he continues being a very successful merchant, but he's made his fortune, and he calls himself a hermit at his hermitage. So this beautiful structure that looks like a small chateau in Castle Hayes, he nicknames the hermitage, and he kind of retreats back to the hermitage and just lives out his life. He lived, I believe he died at 81. His daughter died at 78, and then his other 2 children died in the 50s and 60s. So they had long lives. He had a very long life.
And he's buried in the Wilmington area or on his plantation, or?
He's buried on what is now GE property. Castle Hayes has a big GE compound. The family, it's sad, the family's graveyard is on that property. And prior to 9/11, they would let us go once a year. And I said, let us, I was not fortunate enough to be here yet. They would let Dr. Fonville lead a group to go see some of the features that were left on the GE property, but then after 9/11, they won't let us go on the property, of course.
Any other questions or comments?
He's really fascinating. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have one this one is probably way too long to answer, but just very briefly, when you were talking about the restoration of the house, how when Williamsburg was leading it and things were much more New England oriented, just really briefly, what's the difference between a New England and a Southern restoration? I guess paint colors are different, furniture styles are different.
Yeah, so to begin with, the colors first and foremost. So a lot of like dark greens and like khakis and what do you call it, like dark reds. It's something you really, when people think colonial, they think those colors. Actually, in the southern colonies, especially North Carolina, that has so much Barbados influence, colonial colors tended to be very vibrant. You had lime greens and purples and yellows. Think of like George Washington's home. When you walk in, there's that green, overwhelming room. Also, not matte colors. The The walls would have typically been glossy to reflect light. So just like, again, when you go to Mount Vernon, you walk in the room, it's green, not only very green, but it's also very glossy. So that was something that they weren't doing just yet. They thought everything would be more muted. Now, John Burgwin tends to have European taste. We were a little shocked by the lack of, there's some interesting color. There's one that's a peacock green in the master bedroom. Pictures don't do justice. That visitors are always very interested by. They either love it or don't. But he's very reserved, but he's very European. And something else that we have found in our research is that unlike other colonial homes, or other very prominent homes that tended to acquire furniture from their local cabinet makers, John Burgwin imported all his furnishing from England. He was very much still very English at heart. And so a lot of the pieces we have in the house are going to be European for that purpose. And we tell our visitors that is very much because of John Burgwin's taste, not because it was something that was commonly done. But he was big in mercantile. He imported very fine products and then some very basic ones. But he had a reputation of loving statues, portraits. The Hermitage had a nickname from friends who used to call it the Asian Temple, a lot of Asian pieces. Apparently he had a hall, one of his wings was a hall full of statues. And then he had a room that they called the portrait room, all these beautiful portraits, all lost when the Hermitage burned. Unfortunately, a lot of pieces were lost to family moving away and dispersing it through their family, or because they were lost to the fire. Thankfully, we just acquired a piece. The family donated back a piece, an original banjo clock made by the Willard brothers from New England. So we're hoping to restore that piece this year. But most of the pieces have just been lost to history or to the fire.
Well, Christine, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And Wilmington's not too far from Charleston for those of you who are in this area. It'd be lovely to make a trip up there. Any other questions or comments before we say goodbye?
Well, thank you for having me. You know, it is interesting to interpret somebody a little bit, we call it history against the grain. A lot of people come here and think we're going to talk about the American Revolution and the big patriot, and we're talking about somebody who's human, that gray area. And so I hope you'll join us when one of your visits to Wilmington.
Thank you.